President, fellows, and guests. I've slightly changed the title because the Northern Powerhouse is out of fashion. There's been a political change. It was meant to be topical, but that's the danger of going into dabbling with politics. So a much happier title is the Northern Court. This 1593/4 inventory of the 4th Earl of Derby's goods at Lathom, New Park and Knowsley. So a few other changes in the title, but quite small. Basically this is continuing work on progress on a remarkable document that I've discovered in the library, a manuscript at Knowsley, in the famous library there, mostly devoted to natural history. It's both the account of the death and the funeral of the Henry Stanley, the 4th Earl of Derby, in September 1593. He wasn't buried until December 1593 at Ormskirk Church, a couple of miles away. Now I'll give some, and then the document then follows with a full listing of all the goods of all the main properties of the Earls of Derby, the 4th Earl of Derby. So in particular, obviously, their key property of Lathom, the huge house, fortified house near Ormskirk. We're talking about Lancashire, obviously. And also, secondarily, Knowsley, which is the main residence of the Earls of Derby, the current 19th Earl of Derby. Another property where, in fact, the 4th Earl died, which is just outside Ormskirk, is called New Park, which was a small kind of manor house, which must have been a private house towards the end of his life. Knowsley was the hunting lodge, and that is now the great centre of the Derby, the Stanley Estate and Stud Company. But it is also, Lathom was the great fortified powerhouse known in the 16th century as the Northern Court. And we'll come to why it was called that in a minute. Of course, nothing survives at all of Lathom, and that is why it's so of the original Lathom. It was rebuilt when it went out of the Stanley family in the early 18th century, and only one side wing survives to this day, but we'll see a photograph of that later. So just to give you some context, this is very much work in progress, as I mentioned, and I do need to thank Natasha Simonova for doing the semi-diplomatic transcription of this unpublished document, which is obviously very important for material culture in the late 16th century in England. So that is Knowsley Hall, that's where I work, and the Palladian style portico is this is the southeastern view. You're looking at the Georgian house there with the Edwardian attic story and the rebuilding of the central block. And to the left, which I think we really want to focus more on, is the back of the royal lodgings that were built by Thomas Stanley, the 1st Earl of Derby, in 1495 for the visit of his stepson, Henry VIII, who was married to Lady Margaret Beaufort. Henry. Let me just start that again. So Thomas Stanley was married to Lady Margaret Beaufort, and so the stepson of Thomas Stanley was Henry VII. This is the view, very precious view of the house in the probably about 1700, and it records the house before the Georgian remodelling in the early 18th century. And you can see that it's completely different there with again, it's from the southeast view with the Earl and Countess's lodgings there on at the left-hand side of the image, with the chapel, which is completely gone. There's no chapel there now. This is probably dating from around 1500. You can see two spires behind. They were on the turrets of the royal lodgings, and we'll see a western view of that in a minute. And here is the first slide, really, of the inventory. As you can see, an inventory of the goods of Henry, late Earl of Derby, at Lathom, praised to Robert Asherton, Edward Standish, and Henry Assheton, Thomas Assheton, Esquire, and in the Anno Regni Reginae Elizabeth, the year of our reign of our Queen Elizabeth, on in the 36th year of her reign, 1594, 12th of July. So we have about 50 pages devoted to the death and the funeral, with all the procedure. The full heraldic funeral is listed, with the heralds coming up from London. And if you would like to see a bit more of a detailed account of that, or a very similar account, there is Roger Cohen's excellent article in his book in 2014 on the Heralds and Heraldry in Shakespeare's England. I do recommend that to you. So then you have the full account of all the mourners from the visiting aristocrats, the Earl of Shrewsbury, and all the members of the family, with all the accounts of all the blacks that the black clothing that was issued for them to wear, and right down to the full gentry of Lancashire, and also from Cheshire, because the Earls of Derby were Lord Lieutenants of both Lancashire and Cheshire, and also figures from the Isle of Man, which was another one of their estates from the early 15th century. And then you go into the inventory, starting with Lathom, and room by room. It's a probate inventory, so room by room is listed in the great, effectively, castle, all the smaller properties, and then it ends with Knowsley itself. And I'm really going to focus on, in particular today, on the picture gallery. Of course, it's an extremely revealing document. I'll just say about Lathom is that there are 80 tapestries at Lathom recorded. Only 2 subject matters, the 7 deadly sins in the hall at £60, and that is the most expensive item in the inventory. The other 2 most expensive items or rooms or areas in the great house there are the armoury, which is very extensive. The total of that comes to £160, and then the stables, both at Lathom and at Knowsley. So it's quite interesting to see. So after the tapestries, you have the armour, and then you have the stables. But I'm going to really focus on the gallery at Knowsley. There were no pictures at Lathom. There was a picture gallery. It's called the Gallery at Knowsley. And I believe that the gallery was in the top floor of the Earl and Countess's lodgings, which you can see there on the left. But I'd be very interested to hear your views on that. Just a bit of location. This is 1775, map of Lancashire, the 100 of West Derby. Of course, the title comes from the 100 of West Derby, what's effectively now South Lancashire, including Merseyside and Greater Manchester. You can see Liverpool down there on the Mersey, as it was in 1775, about a town, well, a really burgeoning town, obviously, for about 5,000 souls. And Knowsley is, there you see the detail on the right, Knowsley Park, by the important little market town of Prescott. It's about 7 miles east. And I'm just going to see if we can get... There is Ormskirk up here. That's 9 miles north. So the core estate of the Stanleys of the Earls of Derby runs still today from Prescott up to Ormskirk. That's about 9 miles, about 12,000 acres. And you can see I'll just tell you, there is Lathom. Is just, well, anyway, it's the top right-hand corner. It's about 2 miles east of Ormskirk. And New Park is between the small property, it is marked there, and also a property called Cross Hall. Both of those have disappeared now. And so there you can see Knowsley very close to Prescott. And it's in Prescott, just as an interjection here, that one of the very few purpose-built freestanding playhouses was constructed in the High Street. And this is why that the Shakespeare North project has got going, to recreate an Elizabethan / Jacobean theatre. It was there for about 20 years. We think, from one of the conclusions from the conference at Knowsley last month, was that it was either used as a rehearsal space or as a kind of elite space for the companies like the Queen's Men, Lord Leicester's Men, Lord Essex's Men, and other visiting companies, many other visiting companies, which we know about from the household accounts between 1586 and 1590. we know an awful lot about Prescott because of the records of the court leet at King's College, Cambridge. It's a manor of King's College, Cambridge. Now, just Lathom itself, you can see that in more detail. There is Ormskirk on the left-hand side, Newborough at the upper right, Skelmersdale, now a new town, on the bottom right, and Burscough up at the top there. And you can see Lathom House to the right. This is a recreated map done about 20 years ago for the Lathom Park Trust, who have been very active with archaeological digs there between about the period of 2000 and about 2006. So I commend those reports to you. Also, I should say that the Jennifer Lewis in the Journal of the British Archaeological Association wrote a first-rate article about Lathom in 1999 from an archaeological perspective, and I do recommend that article as well. So there you can see it's on rising ground. It is very flat there on the plains of Lancashire, but that's why both at Knowsley and Lathom were on these they're slightly rising ground with very important strategic views over to the Irish Sea, and obviously Liverpool was the port of access for the Isle of Man and for Ireland. This is something very, very new. There's only one person in this room who's seen this painting. It hung in my office. It's now in conservation. Before the conference for last month on Shakespeare, the Shakespearean conference, we took this painting down and did a surface clean. It was completely black as the frame, which we think is original. We had no idea it was illegible. We couldn't read any of the cartouches or the heraldry. But in fact, the heraldic coat of arms at the bottom is that of Ferdinand Stanley, Lord Strange, 5th Earl of Derby, the patron of Lord Strange's Men, the great company of actors at the Rose, which played at court and all over the country, went to Scotland, to Holyrood, and are often thought to be associated with William Shakespeare. That's for another day. But we're going to have this painting right now being fully cleaned. The background, in fact, is white. And you can see the two lines there going down to Ferdinando with the eagle and child, the Stanley crest there on the left, and then with all the Stanleys there going back to Sir John Stanley, the founder of the dynasty really in Lancashire. And then obviously through the Cliffords and the Cumberlands, Margaret Brandon, and through the royal descent there from Henry VII. So that we expect to have that fully cleaned by about May. It's about 30 by 25 inches. It's on 3 panels. It's in quite. It's a painting that's showing its age, as you can see, and there are some quite big losses. Not all the cartouches. It's a very important work for us because it may be the only painting that survives from Lathom. Everything was destroyed at Lathom in 1645. The great fortified house was razed to the ground after the second great siege by the parliamentarians. Charlotte de la Tremouille, the Countess of Derby, the wife of the 7th Earl, famously defended the house in 1644 before the relief of the siege by Prince Rupert. But the parliamentarians came back the following year and completely destroyed the house. There's very, very little of the contents left. There are a few fragments. The Earls and Countesses were buried at Burscough, which I've already referred to, and there is what's left, we believe, is what's left in the Derby Isle at Ormskirk. Obviously, after the Reformation, the abbey was destroyed and the tombs were moved to the Derby Isle, erected by the 3rd Earl of Derby in the 1560s. And that is likely to be, we think, is Thomas Stanley, the 1st Earl, and his first wife, Eleanor Neville, before he married Lady Margaret Beaufort. And there she is in a later 18th century copy on the right-hand side, which hangs in the state dining room at Knowsley. Obviously very closely based on the portraits associated with Roland Lockie at 2 colleges at Cambridge she founded, Christ's and St John's. We'll come back to Lady Margaret Beaufort a little bit later. Now the gallery at Knowsley, we'll just get straight to that, had 25 pictures. And these include, I'll just read those to you, it won't take long. A picture of King Henry VIII, 2 pictures of Queen Elizabeth, 1 picture of Queen Mary, 1 picture of King Philip of Spain, 1 picture of the Earl of Leicester, one picture of the King of France, which I would take to be Henri III, because the fourth Earl, at the behest of Queen Elizabeth, led a mission with full livery, 300 men in livery, to grant the Order of the Garter to Henri III in 1586. A picture of the Earl of Shrewsbury, which I would take to be George Talbot, the 7th Earl of Shrewsbury. George Talbot, the 6th Earl of Shrewsbury. I think it was Gilbert who came to the funeral of the 4th Earl. 2 pictures of Henry, Earl of Derby. 1 picture of Ferdinando, Earl of Derby, obviously son succeeding his father. 1 picture of Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, and the Queen, his wife, Queen Mary, Dowager Queen of France, and daughter of Henry VII. 1 picture of William, now Earl of Derby, because the Ferdinando was only Earl for 6 months before he was poisoned with arsenic, murdered. So his brother William took over and then was Earl for the next nearly 50 years. 1 picture of the Earl of Sussex, and it's not quite clear which of the Radcliffes that would be. Obviously a very senior figure at court. 1 picture of Monsieur, which I would take to be if it's Henri III, would be the Duc d'Alençon. And 1 picture of Don John of Austria, the illegitimate son of Charles V and sometime governor of the Netherlands, Spanish Netherlands. And then, item 9, pictures of ladies and gentlewomen unknown, which is interesting in itself. Obviously, queens are listed, but the countesses are not, and those would certainly be in that category. And then 5 other items. 1 picture of a woman, and this is very difficult, the transliteration here, weighing her, it's either love or low, it's Lowe, with a feather, and I would be very grateful for any thoughts on that. 1 map of England, possibly Christopher Saxton. 1 map of the counties of Lancashire and Cheshire, which would be obvious for the Lord Lieutenants of Lancashire and Cheshire. And 1 map of a part of Lancashire, which may well be a part of the southwest 100 of West Derby. And then finally, 1 incredibly tantalising item, 1 little map of stones upon Salisbury Plain. And I've made no progress with that. But I think I've come to the right place to find out about that. So I'm just going to, they had no property in Wiltshire. Obviously, it would have been of great antiquarian interest. But anyway, we can discuss that afterwards. But anyway, these are some of the portraits that we have at Knowsley, and also that we know that left Knowsley in the 1650s. Essentially, the early portraits of Knowsley were brought back by the 10th, 12th, and particularly the 13th Earl of Derby, 13th Earls of Derby. There was obviously with the great loss of Lathom and everything that was contained there, and the great loss of property elsewhere and their estates across England, and especially in the northwest, there was a huge attempt later to claw back portraits and furniture that may have been associated with the Earls of Derby. There are a lot of wrong identifications and attributions. It's a very problematic collection, and no one's really worked on the portraits except Scharf, and he did a pretty good job, but there are still some outstanding problems. This we cleaned on the left. It's the 3rd Earl, probably about 1550. It seems to be in the circle of John Betts, I would argue, cleaned about 4 years ago. And there on the right is Henry himself. Here is Henry IV of Derby. Probably we know this is by an artist called Henry Hesketh. It's a copy from about 1630, along with a number of other portraits, one of which you'll see that left Knowsley and in the as I say, in the 1650s, when one of the daughters of the 7th Earl of Derby, who was executed at Bolton for his loyalty to the king in 1651, the Countess Charlotte arranged for the dowries to be property, and nearly all the paintings, or many of the paintings, went into the families of the Earl of Strafford, William Earl of Strafford, 2nd Earl of Strafford, and those paintings are still in the Fitzwilliam inheritance. And there is the 4th Earl of Derby in that copy. They're very, very good copies. They're not fantastic slides. And again here on the right is another copy of the, it's called the Sixth Earl. It's very problematic, this picture. It's sometimes also called Sir William Stanley, the younger brother of the first Earl of Derby, who of course was involved in the Perkin-Warbeck conspiracy and was later executed, but it's clearly from the 1580s, the original picture, and it may be Sir William Stanley of Hooton, who was an outstanding soldier for Elizabeth in the 1580s, but then became, because of his Catholicism, actually in the Spanish Netherlands, turned devented to the Spanish and remained on the continent. But it's a very puzzling picture, if that is the case, as to why it stayed at Knowsley and then obviously went out of the family. And there's much more to research on that picture. Also very puzzling and a very difficult image to understand. It's only a poor photograph from the 1860s, probably commissioned by George Schaff. Shows the fifth Earl on the right. It's a detail from a very large and very blackened painting, probably when he's Earl, because there are the crests in the painting, but with his friends Thomas Gerard of Bryn near Wigan, and they're holding hands. I don't have the whole picture, so it's a picture of friendship, but it's a very, very unusual picture. There's no reason to doubt that it's not from the early 1590s. And there is again a better known image of the Ferdinand the Fifth Earl. This one from Knowsley on the right, with the he's got a very distinctive mole on his forehead, and of course that has this very strong Shakespearean association. Titus Andronicus, the first published quarto of Shakespeare, is dedicated to the Earl of Derby's players and the Earl of Pembroke's players and the Earl of Sussex players. And there is his brother, William. There is William, the Sixth Earl, Circle of Marcus Gerrits in a head and shoulders, but we have a full length of that painting, of that composition at Knowsley as well. He's also deeply involved in the theatre. He's a poet, he's a musician, he's the patron of Paul's Children, the incredibly successful company based out of near to St Paul's Cathedral that that performed at court and was a great success right at the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign, and actually overshadowed the Lord Chamberlain's men. He was very involved in cultural life in Chester, to where he retired. And it may be he, possibly, who had the Heraldic Panel, was involved in the Heraldic Panel being painted. And the candidates for that artist, thinking back to Robert Tytler's work, possibly might be either Thomas Challoner or Randall Holm. But the fourth Earl is certainly, the William the Sixth Earl is certainly corresponding with Randall Holm. And Randall Holm is a noted heraldic painter in Chester, in Cheshire. And just some of the unknown women in perhaps possible candidates. Certainly on the left, these are both at Knowsley. Is this portrait of Alice Spencer of Althorpe, a remarkable literary patron, who married Ferdinando, Lord Strange, later Fifth Earl of Derby, and there's no reason to doubt that isn't a later 16th century portrait, but the face does seem to be very heavily overpainted. And of course she is, the best known image of her is that spectacular tomb at Harefield, out on the fringes of West London, where she had her great house. After the death of the unfortunate death of her husband, the Fifth Earl of Derby, she married her lawyer because she fought a tenacious battle to get properties for her three daughters, Alice, who later married the Earl of Castlehaven, that terrible scandal, and then Francis, who married the John Egerton, first Earl of Bridgewater, and there she is on the right. Just to go back to Lady Alice, she was deeply involved with writers, with masques, and inculcated this with her daughters and with her granddaughters. Quite a lot has been written on her, and she's one of the most important literary patrons of the late 16th, early 17th century. And she commissioned, obviously, Arcades, the mask from Milton, right at the end of her life. There is Frances Stanley, who marries the first Earl of Bridgewater, and obviously she uses the title Lady Brackley as well, and we'll come back to her later. But she has the most important collection of, well, the most important library that a woman has outside the court outside the royal family in the early 17th century. Of course, her library is mostly now at the Huntington Library in California, having been bought by Henry Huntington in 1917. And we have two books from her library at Knowsley, and I'll show you one of those later. That's a Paul van Sommer, and there's another version of that portrait at Ashridge. Now that is really impossible to read, and I'm going to show you the next slide, which will reveal what that is. That is a drawing of Knowsley in the about 1700, commissioned by William the Ninth Earl. It's in a very damaged book of vellum sketches of the park in the States. Very valuable for us because it shows the formal planting, the avenues and formal gardens around Knowsley before those all swept away by Capability Brown after his visits in 1775 and 1776. But it'll all become clear here. This is a drawing from that it's not been published this before. It's dating to about 1800, judging by the paper, pen and wash on paper as opposed to the vellum. And that's just a close-up detail. You're seeing the two cupids in this cartouche who are rolling back this the conceit, they're rolling back the drawing. You can see very clearly there the royal lodgings, the King's Chambers built for Henry VII's and Elizabeth of York's visit, for Henry to see his mother. And you can see those curious spires on top of those battlements. That building, that facade still survives today. The back of it is all Victorian and Edwardian, as a lot of the house interiors are. And you can see the end, you can see then, so that is on the east-west axis. We're on the west side here, and there you can see the Earl and Countess's lodgings in a more of a more typical 16th century style. And then you've got this that's on the left, and then you've got this curious building on the right, which we're not quite sure what that was used for, but it may have been a private apartment, perhaps for the Earl and the Countess themselves. But it's what I show this really because we're trying to work out where the gallery was, and looking at other 16th century buildings, we can. It'd be interesting to see. It might well be on the top floor. Though we do have those. Anyway. It's still an open question. That I'd be interested in your thoughts. And just to show you how the house has developed into one of the greatest houses, or largest, I should say, houses in the country. That is it in a photograph in the 1890s. That's the same view. And of course you can see the new Georgian building there, built by the 10th Earl in the 1720s, with the edge of the library wing there on the north side. And you can see the royal lodgings, the very early Tudor royal lodgings there, but with a Victorian guest and service wing added. That was demolished, as was the library wing in the 1950s. So you'll see the house has been substantially reduced. It was remodelled again in the Edwardian period. And there is, from the southeast view, again looking as with that first image of 1700 of the showing the Tudor house. You can just see part of the back of the royal lodgings there through the trees, though they were battlemented by John Foster in 1820, working for the 12th Earl. That's Pickering 1820s. And there's when the house reached its greatest extent, an aerial view. The house was open to the public between 1948 and 1955. By this stage, it had become one of the 5 largest houses in England. And you're looking from the southwest there. See if I can get that pointer working. There we go. This is the Palladian wing here. This is where that curious smaller structure was, and then you have here This is the royal lodgings here, and there's the state dining room. We'll come to that in a minute. And then that service wing, which is now destroyed. And then here, this would have been the Earl and Countess's lodgings of the 16th century building. Now you're seeing effectively the Georgian wing with the Edwardian superstructure, and then the library wing here. Just to go into the house, just to show how the portraits have been hung later. This is a rather interesting photograph from about 1890, after this great state dining room was remodeled from a neo-Gothic into a neo-Renaissance structure, and a curious arrangement of the furniture there. A damaged photograph, unfortunately. And again, rather amusing, this showing how the house was viewed in the very early 1950s, with the racing trophies out on the table, and you can just make out Lady Margaret Beaufort there. If I can get that cursor going, there it is, there she is, and William the VI Earl. There's the full length here. The portraits, and there's Lady Frances Stanley, the Countess of Bridgewater. The portraits seem to be rather mixed up there in the hang, and there's been an attempt with the to reorder that hang, as you'll see. There on the left, as the hall is now, so the hang has been thinned out, and there you can see William the VI Earl over the fireplace. There's no evidence that any of these pictures, sadly, were at Lathom, and we have to say that probably those pictures may have been destroyed in the Civil War. There is the magnificent neo-Renaissance ceiling in the state dining room from 1890. And other part of this, these attempts by the Earls to recover the lost Tudor and Stuart decorations and interiors, particularly at Lathom, but also at Knowsley, which were obviously swept away in the Georgian refurbishments, are really shown in this slide, which shows the Jacobean Room, which does still survive today. It's quite a small room, but you can see some of the purchases of the 13th Earl in the 1830s of William and Mary chairs there, and a court cabinet there, all of which there were big sales in the 1950s, so those have gone, but all presided over by Charlotte de la Tremouille, the formidable Countess to the 7th Earl, and that's a picture that was bought from Strawberry Hill in 1842, the famous sale. The 13th Earl was one of the biggest buyers at that sale, buying books, manuscripts, painting, sculpture, ceramics, watercolours, very high quality miniatures as well. And there's the Jervis there of the after Van Dyck of the Dorothy Sidney, Countess of Sunderland, which is still in the collection. But this is in an Edwardian building. This is from 1913. Henry Romaine Walker, probably bringing in other wainscoting, and it's a very very high quality. But the plasterwork is almost certainly from the early 20th century. Now, going on to Lathom, or going back to Lathom, of course, we have no idea what Lathom looked like, except from what we have from the inventory, where we have, of course, we have accounts of people who went there, and they tend to talk about the Great Eagle Tower, and there you can, these are two remarkable images of it from the Misericords at Manchester Cathedral, which was the collegiate church, which was very much under the Stanley family control. Of course, there was the college attached, now Cheetham School of Music, with the famous library of Humphrey Cheetham from the 1650s onwards. So these are Misericords. They're very high quality. They were commissioned by James Stanley, the youngest son of the first Earl, who was made Bishop of Ely by Lady Margaret Beaufort, through her influence, let's say. And he, at the end of his tenure as warden of the college at Manchester, commissioned this spectacular choir, and these, unfortunately, the organ is being rebuilt, and when I went there last weekend, I couldn't actually do a new photograph of these, but to show you the quality of these carvings, that's the famous backgammon players, and there is the choir. You can see this organ under scaffolding. Really a very, very high quality. They're well worth seeing if you're in Manchester. But just to, so the accounts show the Eagle Tower surrounded by this curtain wall of 9 towers, very well defended, obviously, with a moat and on the rising ground. We know from the household accounts of of Edward III Earl, that there were 170 household at Knowsley, and his hospitality was quite lavish and legendary. Now, as to the furnishings, the one item that seems we can place at Lathom with some security is this remarkable bed. It's known as the Stanley Bed. It was sold out of a furniture antique dealers in the 1980s, and I understand that it's in America. It's but in a private collection. So this is the photograph, an earlier photograph. Unfortunately, don't have a more recent one. It's so clearly a very lavish bed. It's very typical of ornate carved woodwork from the late 15th, early 16th century. It's probably been a bit reconstructed, as these beds often are. There are 2 other beds that are around at the moment that are under discussion as possibly coming from Lathom stroke Knowsley, though it's more likely to be Lathom. There are 2 beds in my lord's chamber at Lathom and in the main guest room, and they're in their rooms that are projecting from the Eagle Tower into the courtyard, and they have some of the most expensive furnishings, including tapestries in there. And this bed has never, certainly we don't have any, apart from this reference in the inventory of the goods of the 4th Earl, we don't have any more archival evidence about this. And until I've seen the bed, it would be difficult to make any further judgment. But certainly we know that the two beds went into the Strafford inheritance in the 1650s. And of course, these are listed in the will of the William II Earl of Strafford when he died in the 1690s. And so there is this possible candidate for the other bed, which may have been commissioned for the royal visit of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Anyway, I leave that one with you. Obviously, very high quality woodwork was being commissioned through the Stanley family, as you've seen in the Manchester Cathedral stalls. When I say that nothing's left of Lathom, the house itself, on the park there is this chapel does survive, the Lathom Park Chapel, from the 15th and 16th century, and we do have this little guidebook which gives an account of it. It's mostly 18th century in the interiors. And then there is this wonderful brass lectern, which is reputedly came from Burscough Priory. Obviously was dissolved in the Reformation, in the dissolution of the monasteries. And this is after the destruction of Lathom in 1645. Nothing really happened until the 9th Earl began to rebuild it at the end of the 17th century. And then his daughter, Lady Ashburn, sold it to the local Bootle family, who later became Bootle Wilbraham and then the Earls of Skelmersdale. And they commissioned this from Leone, this early 18th century house as you can see in this Palladian style with the 2 projecting wings, and it's the left wing that survives to this day. The rest was demolished in the 1920s. Now, just also I want to say a little bit about, there's a very tantalising entry in the inventory. I've talked about the gallery at Knowsley, I've talked about the armoury, I've talked about the stables. There is an entry for the library at Lathom, but then sadly there is no reference to any of the books. And our first inventory of the books at Knowsley is 1679, but which of course really represents a reconstructed library with the 8th Earl of Derby. But we do have a few books from the earlier period which even though they're not, they were bought later in the 19th century, I think they do perhaps evoke what might have been there in the library. Of course, this is the wink and a word of the fruitful sayings of fruitful sayings of David the King and the Prophet by John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, who was confessor to Lady Margaret Beaufort. And so there would have been, undoubtedly would have been personal material like that. I'm not saying that this would have been at Lathom or at Knowsley, but certainly they might have been there at some point. It's a small room. It has very little furnishings. It's almost like a closet room in the private apartments. And this is another great treasure we have, again acquired in the early 19th century by the very antiquarian-minded 13th Earl. This is with its original binding, gold stamped TC. This is Laurentius Valor, and this is the history of the King Ferdinand of Aragon. It's Paris 1521, and it's signed at the top Thomas Cantuarius Quondam, and that's TC Thomas Cranmer. And then it's also signed Arundel, the Earl of Arundel, and the Earl of Lumley, John Earl of Lumley. So it's got and it's also a duplicate sold by the British Museum in 1787. But a rather wonderful and precious thing. And then just going back to to Lady Alice Spencer, the Countess of Derby, the wife of the 5th Earl, and her daughter, her middle daughter, Lady Frances Stanley, who married John Edgerton, 1st Earl of Bridgewater. We have 2 volumes. We have, but this is particularly precious because it's an octavo, and I think if we're going to find any more Stanley or Derby books from the early period, this is what they will look like, with this extraordinary embossing into the leather of the eagle and child with the coronet, eagle and child being the Derby crest. It's the Progress of Piety, being the 3rd part of the it's a book of prayers by John Norden, London 1604, and with these various inscriptions. Obviously a later inscription at the top saying that this belonged to Alice, the Dowager Countess of Derby, and obviously was probably bought by her. And then so that's on the first title of the first front leaf, and then you have the second front leaf, and that is F. Brackley, me tenet ex dono matris suae. And so that's Frances Brackley, and of course the Brackley is the courtesy title of the Countess of Bridgewater, holds me as a gift from her mother. So that is obviously a very, very personal item in the Bridgewater and in the Countess of Bridgewater's library. And then fascinatingly, on the title page, it's signed Alice Egerton, and that is the daughter of the Earl and Countess of Bridgewater, and of course she is the focal point of the Masque of Milton's Comus that was performed at Ludlow Castle when John, 1st Earl of Bridgewater, was made Warden of the Marches, and that was just been recently recreated at the Wanamaker Theatre at the Globe, and I hope some of you were able to see that absolutely wonderful recreation from the 1634 Masque. So I think this is really very suggestive of the kind of books that might have been in the library. And if we're talking about players and the Derby men and the Strangers men and those leading companies performing at Lathom and at Knowsley, we know that they performed there many times. That this material would have been available within those family and in that northern court environment. Of course, the family did have a house in London. The Derbys, at what's now the College of Heralds, and then later in Cannon Row in the 16th century. Obviously, other houses in other parts of London later through the centuries. Just to show you the program, well, not the program, but just how we presented the Shakespeare conference. And obviously we have a 4th folio at Knowsley, and there's from the frontispiece of Shakespeare, the famous Martin van Droeshout engraving with the detail of Ferdinand, the Lord Strange, the 5th Earl of Derby opposite him, and then the view of the house from the late 17th century. And just finally, just something rather new like the Heraldic Panel, and again, there's only one person in the room who's seen this, just thought I'd show you that. It's just been cleaned brilliantly by our conservator in the Liverpool Conservation Centre. It's only been in the Derby collection since 1889, when it was bought by the 15th Earl of Derby, who was Foreign Secretary, a politician, but also a long-standing trustee of the National Portrait Gallery, and it was he who published the George Shaft's privately printed catalogue of the pictures at Knowsley in 1875. And the 15th Earl didn't really buy many pictures, but he did buy this picture under recommendation from George Shaft. And and of course George Shaft then published it in the Journal of Archaeology, the journal of this learned society. And it's called "Four Elizabethan Gentlemen of High Rank Playing Primero." And it was very discoloured under thick yellow varnish. And it's quite a large painting. It's probably about I'd say it's about 3 foot by 5 foot. It's on 4 boards. We've had the dendrochronology done. It's by Ian Tyers. It's Baltic oak, but 1550 to 1590. We've had obviously the coins analysed by numismatists. They're all portraits. They're all identifiable. And they're a mixture of gold escudos and half escudos, for obviously Spanish Portuguese currency, and then also there are groats and half groats in silver from Henry VIII and following monarchs up to Elizabeth. The last datable coin is a Queen Elizabeth silver groat of 1561. So this is I think it's quite strong evidence for a kind of a last date at which this painting could have been painted. We do know that there was another version of this painting. We have in the file at Knowsley a photocopy of a black and white photograph of a painting that was destroyed in a fire in Gloucestershire in 1962. It's of higher quality than this painting. But actually everything was revealed in terms of that pillar was completely invisible behind it. So I don't think there's any symbolic meaning to it. In terms of interpreting the painting, and there are differences between the 2 foreground figures on either side, differences both in the cards, the number of cards, but also the differences in the way that their hands are arrayed. The cards and the coins and the card holders, which actually has the Tudor rose on it, seem to be similar, and certainly the configuration of the portraits and their poses is similar. These faces have been, at a very early stage, were very heavily repainted, so we've not attempted to take off that overpaint. That's why they look rather flat, the paintings, and only one of them, the second figure from the left, has that rather kind of unhappy aspect. The others seem to be very bland, which is really to do with the overpaint that remains on the painting. Primero obviously was a very elite and popular form of card playing, but at court with Henry VIII right through to Elizabeth, and of course it's a precursor of poker. It's a very widely reproduced image, particularly for Elizabethan Tudor culture and obviously in histories of card games. It's in terms of its meaning, this picture we know has a provenance through Christie's in the late 1880s and then the 1780s from the Carey family, from the Viscounts Falkland, and of course they're the descendants of the Lord Hunsdon, famously as the Lord Chamberlain's men in Elizabeth's reign, and so it's very likely that this is commissioned by, if it's 1561, he's a privy councillor from early in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, and he may be the figure on the left. Again, interesting to hear comments from you in the audience. And then the figure on the left in that case might be William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. Again, obviously absolutely fundamental in Elizabeth's governance. And so these then, the two older figures, the identity still to be unravelled, could be older members of the Privy Council. It may be a kind of allegory. Obviously, it's a portrait, it's a quadruple portrait, but there may be some allegorical or political meaning in the picture. So there's really I think I'll close the talk there, but obviously very much work in progress. There's a lot more to do, and I'm talking to quite a lot of specialists in portraiture, but also in material culture and particularly up in the Northwest. But I really welcome your comments on any particular facets of this talk and other aspects of the inventory. So thank you.